Now let's talk about our course goals. What are we trying to do this term? As UBC has stated, this new course asks how COVID-19 is impacting society, and there has been lots of rich discussion and debate about this question. This course will address these debates and so much more. We have at least 4 course goals, and you can see these on the first page of our syllabus in the upper right-hand corner. By the end of this course, you should be able to apply the sociological imagination to explore COVID-19 as a global and public issue, explain how COVID-19 has diverse impacts on marginalized groups, discuss processes of social interaction under pandemics, and explore the impact of COVID-19 on social institutions. Let's talk briefly about each of these goals. This course will prepare you to understand your own COVID experiences in their larger social and historical context, and to appreciate the unique and diverse experiences of other people in different parts of the world under COVID. Essentially, you'll get a broader perspective, and this perspective is useful in identifying why things are happening the way they are, and where to put your energy and efforts. As we'll discuss next class, the sociological imagination enables us to understand how our experiences are shaped by society and how we recreate and reshape society through our everyday decisions and actions. After all, what is society if not the aggregated actions of individual people? Because what we do matters, and because we are studying a pandemic while it is unfolding, our class will work on projects that have the potential for immediate community impact. More about this later. By the end of this course, you should be able to explain how COVID-19 has diverse impacts on marginalized groups. A key theme in this course is social inequality. But what makes inequality social in nature as opposed to biological, for example? When sociologists talk about social inequality, they are doing so in a very specific way. Sociologists look at social inequality at a systems level, systems of social stratification. Social stratification is the hierarchical arrangement of large social groups based on their control over basic resources. What do we mean by a social group? This doesn't need to be a formal group. It could be based on any socially significant status. Let's think about age. Children tend to have different rights and resources than adults, and this is often encoded in law, like the right to vote. Other socially significant statuses are ability, race, ethnicity, immigration status, the languages you speak, accent, gender, sexuality, and socioeconomic status. Resources are anything valued in the particular society under study. So what might these be in Canada? This could be money, which we'd need to break down not just by income, but by wealth, which could include assets like property. We would also include education as a resource, your social networks, who you know and who the people you know, your status, and the influence you have over others would also be basic resources. All societies throughout human history have had social stratification. This is nothing new. Stratification is indeed a universal but variable feature of human social organization. What differs is the basis for this inequality. In other words, what exactly is unequal, as well as how much, the degree of inequality, and the way it is justified. The commonly accepted myths that make the inequality seem somewhat legitimate or acceptable. If you want to know what the myths are that you have learned, think about what crosses your mind when, let's say, you pass a person living on the street. How do you explain to yourself why they are there? Why might it be okay to walk past them, perhaps without making eye contact even? We are going to ask how COVID interacts with systems of stratification. How has COVID affected social inequality? And how has social inequality informed the spread of COVID? In other words, how has this pandemic exacerbated, exposed, and even altered the way basic resources are hierarchically arranged between social groups? And what are some potential solutions or interventions? Because social stratification is a trait of society, systems of stratification exist before people fill these systems. For example, jobs for low-wage frontline COVID workers and CEOs exist before any individual worker fills them. So why is there a picture of a boat on this slide? Because I am going to talk about the Titanic. In 1912, when the Titanic sunk, over 1,500 people died and 705 survived. Did you know this survival rate was organized based on a particular social grouping? This grouping was passenger class. In first class, 62.5% of people survived. First class passengers had cabins away from the bottom of the ship, where water entered first. They were at the top of the ship with the best views. First class passengers were able to get out onto the decks more quickly and were able to make it aboard the lifeboats. In the coach class, only 27% of people survived. And this is not just about class. People in coach class were more likely to be immigrating to build a new life. So here we see class intersecting with other social statuses as well. Keep in mind that we're not studying social inequality at the individual level, we are studying it at the group level. The group is our unit of analysis, in other words. So in my analysis, I'm not asking about the swimming level or motivations of each individual person on the Titanic. The good news is that if a form of inequality is rooted in societal organization, in how we structure our communities, our countries, or even just our boats, then this means there is potential for social restructuring. So let's revisit our learning objective. We are going to explain how COVID-19 has diverse impacts on marginalized groups. COVID affects us all, but not in the same way and certainly not to the same degree. So we'll look at COVID and race, thinking about racialized groups and racism under the pandemic. We'll consider anti-Asian racism, particularly in the Vancouver context, with highlights in the articles shown here. Even the language used around the virus is something to take into account. How this symbolic communication can inform our perspective and ultimately inform racist discourse. The course also tackles systemic racism against Indigenous people and Indigenous communities in healthcare systems in Canada and around the world. It's particularly important for First Nations to protect elders from COVID. The passing of an elder is an enormous loss to community networks and knowledge passed down generationally. The course will discuss anti-Black racism and how this intersects with health outcomes under COVID. And this is not just a US phenomenon. This is happening in Canada as well. But it is complex and even includes how we collect COVID health data based on racial markers or not. And we'll consider the compounding challenges of state violence and COVID health outcomes in the context of this anti-Black racism. The course asks further about the experiences of COVID for different age groups. The impacts of ageism in society's response are notable under this pandemic. We'll talk about ageism in healthcare research and ask which social groups are included and excluded from COVID clinical trials. We'll highlight in particular care facilities for elders and how they became hotbeds for COVID infection. We'll discuss COVID and socioeconomic status, how COVID plays out in ways organized by class. We see here people in lower income households are at higher risk of serious illness if infected with coronavirus. So how does one's class affect things like your ability to self-isolate, your ability to work from home, or your ability to access medical supports? We'll talk about COVID and gender. Why does it matter that women and racial minorities are overrepresented as frontline workers? We'll consider experiences of working from home and balancing domestic and childcare responsibilities and how these experiences are structured by gender in many cases. We'll also talk about domestic violence under lockdown and resources that are emerging for survivors of this violence. We'll consider the experiences of the LGBTQ2SI+ community under COVID, especially how sexuality and gender identity intersect with COVID healthcare access and treatment.